My husband had just been laid to rest when the lawyer said our house and $5 million belonged to my daughter, and all that was left for me was a rotting cabin in the woods. The room smelled of lilies and coffee, the AC too cold for my thin black dress as papers slid across the mahogany like knives. I'm Margaret Bennett, 67, and in that instant the life I'd built for 42 years cracked like old glass. Ashley didn't look at me. She kept her gaze on the embossed letterhead, a shine on her manicure that caught the fluorescent light. I heard nothing but the tick of the wall clock and the word bequeath, as if it were a final insult whispered in Latin. My hands trembled so hard the styrofoam cup left a ring of coffee on the will. James and Rowe, attorneys at law, smelled like leather and money, and Mr. Rowe's voice was smooth as a radio ad, mercilessly calm. He tapped the clause. Primary residence to Ashley Lynn Bennett. Brokerage accounts totaling $5 million to the same. Personal property at Ashley's discretion. To me, a single sheet. A deed to a leaning cabin on a forgotten lake in Maine. Penciled notes about deferred maintenance, and a Polaroid of moss on the roof. My daughter finally met my eyes with a tight smile that said, "It's not personal, Mom. It's just what Dad wanted." I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted iron, swallowing words that would have set the room on fire. Outside, traffic hissed on rain-slick asphalt, the world moving on while my name was reduced to a line item. "How?" I asked, my voice coming out small, like a child's in church. Mr. Rowe adjusted his flag pin and explained the updates last November. The trust my husband set up, the signatures notarized between pumpkin pie and football. Ashley's jaw clenched when I said, "You knew." And she said she was just following the paperwork, executor duties, nothing more. 42 Christmases, 2 mortgages, 1,000 dinners I plated, measured against a cabin key that dug into my palm like a shard. I pasted on the widow's composure they expect in this country, smiled at the receptionist, and walked into the drizzle feeling suddenly homeless. If you're wondering how a family can smile for holiday photos while planting a legal knife in the matriarch's back, I'll show you exactly how we got here. You will hear about the Thanksgiving conversation that changed everything, the subtle edits to a will I never saw, and the moment my own daughter chose inheritance over me. You'll smell the damp wood of that cabin when I first opened its swollen door, and the truth that was waiting inside. Because money doesn't just reveal people, it rearranges them, and I learned that the hard way on a gray Tuesday. If you believe no widow should be blindsided by a signature, subscribe and stay with me for the rest of this story. There's a reason he left me the one place everyone forgot, and there's a reason that decision might just save me. I stood on the curb with my coat open to the drizzle because I didn't know how to close it anymore. The smell of lilies from the service clung to my sleeves, sweet and suffocating, and the lawyer's building threw a pale reflection in the puddles at my feet, letters swimming and writing themselves with each ripple. I could still see the papers sliding across the table, the embossed letterhead that caught the light like polished bone, and Ashley's face angled just so, careful, distant. I'm Margaret Bennett. I am 67 years old, and until this morning I thought I understood what home meant. When I finally made myself move, I didn't go straight back to the house. I drove aimlessly through streets I'd driven for decades, past the bakery that always put out a tray of blueberry muffins at 7, past the playground where I pushed Ashley in a squeaky swing until my shoulders ached, past the high school football field that in autumn smells like wet leaves and hot dogs. I stopped at a drive-thru and ordered coffee I didn't need, because holding something warm made me feel like I could hold myself together. There was a time when my days had a rhythm that hummed through the house like the washer on its spin cycle. 6 a.m. I'd put on the kettle, even though Ed always insisted coffee tasted better if it started in a cold pot. 7. The hydrangeas on the table would show a bit of morning through the curtains. 8. I'd pack lunches. Turkey on whole wheat for Ed when he still went into the office every day. Carrot sticks and a little note for Ashley when she was small. A heart drawn in the corner because that's the kind of mother I wanted to be. I'd wipe down counters, start a load of laundry, check the mail, call my sister in Ohio. And the house sang with small, faithful work. That's how you hold a life together, I believed. You stitch the seams so the fabric can be worn again. Lately, that rhythm had been replaced by the quiet metronome of worry, Ed's pills lined up in their little organizer, the murmured hospice visits, the way I learned the language of blood pressure readings and sodium content, the way I could tell from his breathing if the night would be long. I kept track of the war on Post-its. Call insurance, refill prescription, schedule scan, breathe, and I did it gladly. For 42 years, I built a life around other people's needs because that is what you do when you made promises in a small church with wildflowers on the altar and your hand in the hand of a man who said he would take care of you too. On the afternoon he left me, because death, however dressed in black suits and casserole dishes, is still a leaving, we stood around the gravesite, and Ashley squeezed my arm with fingers that felt like a vice. "We'll get through the paperwork," she whispered, as if the paperwork were a storm we could outrun if we just moved fast enough. I believed her, because I wanted to. I always wanted to believe the best of her. She was my only child. I remember the day she was born, the breathless panic and joy, Ed's terrified grin. We took her home in December, the house smelling like pine and gingerbread, her little cap so tiny it fit in my palm. I sang her to sleep with "You Are My Sunshine," and told myself I'd do anything for this bright, fierce creature. And I did. When I pulled into our driveway after the will reading, Ashley's car was already there, polished and quiet like a well-fed cat. She was standing in the foyer with a clipboard. The funeral urn sprays had been tidied into tall vases, the sympathy cards fanned on the console table. Everything in its place. She looked like a photograph. Flawless ponytail, glossy trench coat, perfume that smelled expensive and faintly like pears. "Mom," she said, and it sounded less like an embrace and more like a task. "I thought I'd make us some tea," I said out of habit, slipping out of my damp shoes and setting my keys in the little bowl by the door. The hallway rug, the one we bought at LL Bean on a trip to Freeport 20 years ago, warmed my toes. This was my hallway. I knew which floorboard groaned when the weather turned and the exact angle to set the front door so it wouldn't slam. Ashley glanced at the kitchen as if it might require a permit. "We don't have time." Mr. Rowe sent over a checklist. I scanned it. "We need to change the utilities into my name by Friday. Also, the homeowners. The car registration is a separate thing. It'll be easier if I keep the Lexus. Dad always said it was on the business account. You can take the Subaru for now." For now. The words floated like balloons I didn't want, shiny and impossible to hold. "Ashley," I said, resting my hand on the banister Ed and I had sanded and stained ourselves back when we thought every project could be solved with a weekend and a trip to Home Depot. "Can we talk about this later? I just need to sit." She checked something off on her clipboard. "I know this is a lot, but it's already Tuesday. The longer we wait, the messier the paperwork gets. The house will need some updates, and I can't get contractors in if it's not in my name. I'm just trying to do what Dad wanted." She didn't say, "It's not personal." She'd already said that with her eyes in the lawyer's office. The thing about being a mother is you learn your child's vocabulary before they ever speak. I could read the curve of her mouth like a sentence. She believed she was being efficient, practical, strong. She was also telling me there was no room for my grief in the plan. "I need some boxes," Ashley said briskly. "I hired a moving company for Thursday. They'll pack the guest room and your closet. We can put your things in storage in the meantime. And we should talk about the dinnerware. Someone at my office recommended a resale place for the china. Apparently there's a market for it." My mother's china? I heard my voice and wondered who I was imitating. My mother when she found out I'd eloped. Myself when I discovered Ashley had pierced her nose in college. There are registers you don't know you have until you need them. Ashley flipped a page. "Mom, we can't keep everything. The house isn't a museum. I'll pick a few pieces that fit with my decor." My hands went cold. I remembered the day my mother wrapped each dish in tissue, her hands serious. She whispered stories as if the blue willow pattern could hold them. A birthday during the war when the ration coupons didn't stretch. The first family Thanksgiving where we didn't burn the rolls. I had promised to keep them safe. Promises are tricky. They don't fit on checklists. "I'll decide what goes with me," I said. And even I was surprised at the steadiness in my voice. "Not a moving company. Not today." She met my eyes then, and for a second, I saw the little girl who used to stand on a chair to help me frost cupcakes, her hair escaping its barrette, smudges of chocolate on her chin. Then it was gone. We're on a timeline, Mom. Taxes don't wait. A thin sliver of something sharp slid under my ribs. Disdain doesn't always look like a slammed door. Sometimes it looks like tidy planning. Sometimes it looks like your daughter calling you Mom, with a tone that turns the word into a formality. I went to the kitchen anyway. I put water on to boil because making tea is a ritual that doesn't ask for permission. The quartz counter was cool under my palms. Here was where I'd rolled out pie crusts and flattened cookies with the bottom of a glass. Here is where, last November, I had set out pumpkin pie and whipped cream and listened through the doorway as Ed and Ashley used words like irrevocable and executor and basis, voices low and reasonable between the commercials of a football game. It was Thanksgiving, and the house had smelled like sage and butter, and the candle Ashley had brought, one of those that come in heavy jars and smell like expensive lumber. Ed had been tired that day. His smile fogged at the edges, but he was adamant about carving the turkey himself. He liked the ceremony of it, the attention. After we ate, while I put coffee into mugs with our initials, MB and EB, a gift from the year we convinced each other monograms were charming, the doorbell rang. It was Denise from church, cheeks flushed from the cold, a notary stamp in her bag because she did everything for everyone. Just a little bit of paperwork, Ed had said, squeezing my shoulder. For taxes. Ashley's going to help us organize things. I had wiped my hands and dried them on a towel and looked at the stack of documents on the table. Pages and pages with little flags that said, "Sign here." "I can finish the dishes later," I said. "I should sit in on this, right?" "It's nothing you need to fuss about," Ashley said, quick as a wink, moving the papers into a neat pile. "It's mostly signatures, Dad's trust stuff. We'll go over it after, I promise." I remember my reluctance, a small animal shifting in my chest. I remember the timer going off for the pecan pie. I remember the way Ed pressed his lips together around the word protect. "This is just to protect what we've built," he said. Protect it for whom? I should have asked. But there were guests in the living room. The grandchildren of our friends were sprawled on the rug, sorting Lego into towers. The Detroit Lions were losing. There are so many little sounds at Thanksgiving that swallow your questions. Now, in the quiet kitchen with the kettle lurching toward a boil, I put my hand on the counter and closed my eyes and let that day replay. Denise's stamp, the way it thumped on the paper. Ed's shaky signature. Ashley's attention like a beam of light that never touched me. "Protect," he said. "Foundations. Tax efficiency. It saves on probate," Ashley had explained later, like a teacher. "Less messy for you." I poured the water over the tea bag and watched the color curl like smoke. It was too hot to drink. I sipped anyway. It scalded my tongue and brought me back to now. When I walked out of the kitchen, Ashley was scrolling her phone. "Oh," she said, looking up. "By the way, I changed the code on the alarm. I'll text you the new one. You know, just in case." In case. Another balloon I didn't want. "In case what?" I asked, but she was already typing, thumbs moving fast the way young people's do, as if they could text their way out of discomfort. That night I lay in the bed where Ed had slept beside me for half my life and listened to the house groan the way old houses do when the air changes. I stared at the ceiling and saw flashes of our life like a flip book. Ed teaching Ashley to ride a bike in the driveway, his hands open, ready to catch, the pink streamers on her handlebars bright in the sun. Ed standing at a grill in June, holding a spatula like a conductor, crowing over burgers that always needed a few more minutes. Ed at the dining room table with tax forms, tapping his pencil, frowning in concentration. Ed in the passenger seat the last months, pointing out birds as if the world was going to empty out of names and he had to spend them while he could. I thought of the sacrifices I had made, and I know sacrifice can sound like a medal you pin on yourself, but they were quiet choices, the kind that don't earn applause. I gave up a job I loved at the downtown library when Ashley was born, because we couldn't make the childcare math work. I didn't buy a new winter coat for 5 years after Ed's first layoff. I sold my grandmother's ring, not the diamond I never had, but a simple band with 3 tiny sapphires to help with Ashley's tuition when her scholarship fell through. I learned to make a casserole stretch when Ed's mother moved in with us for a winter and needed doctors and was embarrassed about the way her body betrayed her. I went to school plays, even when nobody else's mother sat alone in the front row and clapped hard because my daughter had a one-line part, and it mattered. I took night classes in bookkeeping because Ed's second business idea needed someone who could turn a shoebox of receipts into something the IRS understood. I believed in him when the bank did not. And in all those years, what we built felt mutual, like a house you both hammer together. One person holds the board while the other swings the hammer. It turns out you can hold a board steady for 40 years and not notice the wall they were building shut you out. 2 mornings later, the movers came. Kind young men in shirts printed with their company's name. They didn't know they were packing a life. I stood by the door, directing traffic, putting little colored stickers on boxes. The blue ones went to storage. The green ones were what I would take with me to Maine, because I didn't know how long I would be there. And the idea of choosing was like stepping into a river you couldn't see the bottom of. Ashley fluttered from room to room like a realtor staging a house. She set aside things she called donations, a word that made my stomach twist. "We'll get you settled," she promised. "I called the electrician up there. He can meet you Saturday." "The cabin has electricity?" I asked before I could stop myself. All I had was a Polaroid of a roof smeared with moss and penciled notes about deferred maintenance. I had been to the cabin exactly twice. Once, the summer after Ed and I married, when we spent a weekend hammering loose shutters back on their hinges and catching sunfish from the dock. He told me then it had been his uncle's place, a family thing he'd never given much thought. The second time was a fall afternoon 10 years later when we were visiting his cousin in Portland and took a detour. We couldn't find the right turn and gave up after 20 minutes. Life has a way of rerouting you so many times you forget the original map. "Of course," Ashley said, making a little face to show I was being dramatic. "It's rustic, but it's not primitive. You'll be fine. There's a space heater in the notes Mr. Rowe sent. I bought you a new flannel blanket, too. A new blanket. The old ones could be boxed and labeled green. Cabin." My things became dots of color in Ashley's spreadsheet brain. It was efficient. It was kind, if you squinted. It was also a way of moving me like furniture. When they loaded the framed wedding photo, I put my hand on the glass and felt the cooled heat of a day in May, and Ed's hand over mine. New calluses ready to do the work of a life. I should have seen then the way you can be loved as a function. Who was I if not the woman who held things together? On Friday morning, I loaded the Subaru. I put the blue willow teacups on the passenger floor, nested in towels. I loaded a suitcase, a box of photo albums, a quilt my mother sewed in a winter when we were all sick and broke and ate too much soup. I tucked a tin of Earl Grey into the side pocket like a talisman. I stood in the doorway of the house that would no longer be mine and touched the frame where we used to pencil Ashley's height. Little notches like a fence we could climb over with our eyes. I closed the door quietly. The new alarm code beeped to life, cool and impersonal. I had texted Ashley that I'd call when I got there. "Drive safe," she replied with a heart emoji, as if love was the same thing as approval. It took me 8 hours to get to the town listed on the deed. I stopped at a Dunkin' off I-95 because that's what you do in New England. You buy coffee that tastes like morning, and you roll your sleeves against whatever weather the sky has decided to throw at you that day. The highway unwound like ribbon, and I let the miles carve something out of me that felt like space. By the time I crossed the Piscataqua River Bridge into Maine, the drizzle had thickened, and the radio crackled with a bluegrass program that made me think of road trips we never took. Signs for Freeport and Brunswick flashed by. Then the highway narrowed. Then it was me and a 2-lane road through pines that reached like cathedral columns. Somewhere along there I passed a Rennis. The "A Maine Adventure" sign made me smile in spite of myself, and I thought of the winter hats we bought once with pom-poms to make ourselves laugh. The town was small enough that the post office shared a building with the library. The general store had a wooden porch, and a handwritten sign advertised Friday bean supper at the Grange. I followed the directions from Mr. Rowe's packet, turning onto a road that turned into a lane that turned into a suggestion. The trees opened, and there it was. The cabin crouched at the edge of a lake, calibrating itself to late spring. A sheet of pewter rippling into silver when the wind touched it. The dock looked like a tired spine. A loon called somewhere far off, the sound like someone remembering a secret. The front steps complained when I stepped on them. The key from the mat left grit in my palm. The door stuck, and when it yielded, it did so with a breath like somebody who'd been holding it too long. The air inside smelled like old wood, and mouse droppings, and the ghost of last winter's fire. I stood in the doorway and let my eyes adjust. A narrow kitchen to the left, a small living area with a stone fireplace straight ahead, a bedroom to the right with a bed that looked like it had been made by someone who cared in a hurry. I set my boxes down and sat on the sagging couch and listened to the cabin speak in creaks and whispers. "Hello," I said aloud, because I have always believed in greeting spaces. "I'm Margaret." The cabin offered no opinion. It did not reject me. It felt like a hand held out, palm up. I went to the kitchen and opened a cabinet. There were 4 plates, unmatched, and 2 chipped mugs that said "World's Best Uncle" in faded block letters. In one drawer, a nest of rubber bands and a corkscrew. In the silverware tray, 3 forks, 2 spoons, and a knife with a wooden handle that had bounced through more lives than it deserved. I found a box of matches in a floured tin and coaxed the fireplace into an embered glow, the way I had taught myself to coax my own breath in those long hospital nights. Slowly, steadily, with patience I didn't know I had until I needed it. I slept hard and woke stiff. Morning poured through the windows lukewarm and apologetic. Outside, something splashed in the shallows, and a squirrel scolded me from the pine outside the door. I made tea. I abused the same mug twice and told myself I didn't mind. I opened the back door and stepped onto the porch, and the air stepped into me, cool, peat damp, full of things I couldn't name. I sat with my tea and watched fog peel itself off the lake in slow strips. Somewhere, a motor hummed, and a boat made a delicate stitch across the water. Around 10, a car rolled up, the tires crunching gravel like breakfast cereal. A man climbed out, long and thin, a Red Sox cap pulled low. "Mornin'," he called, and in that single syllable I heard the patient vowels of a place where winter lasts a little longer than you think, and some people like it that way. "You must be Margaret." "I am," I said, stepping off the porch. "And you are—" "Cal." He stuck out a hand the way men used to when introductions were agreements. "Calvin Morrissey. Place down the way. Used to fish this lake with your husband when we were kids. Well," he tugged his cap. "Men. Took us a while to grow up. Tried to, anyway." His grin was quick, at odds with the careful way he stood, as if he were always carrying something he didn't want to drop. "Thank you for coming," I said before I'd fully decided what I was thanking him for. Maybe for being a familiar thing in a strange morning. The familiar is a kindness. Word gets around. He shrugged. "Saw a car with Massachusetts plates yesterday. Figured it was you. Last time I saw Ed here was—" He squinted. "Must have been 15 years ago. Came up with a buddy, tried to fix that dock. Said he'd bring his wife next time." He tilted his head, appraising me gently. "He didn't. He talked about it," I said, because in that sentence were years of intentions. "Life got busy." "Yeah?" he said, and the sound of it made me smile. A whole philosophy in 2 letters. "You got a decent roof. Needs shingles. Mice will be a nuisance come fall if you don't set traps. What did they tell you about the property line?" "Not much." I indicated the stack of papers on the table inside. The deed. The map photocopied so many times the edges had gone gray. "I know the lot number. The survey date looks like the late 60s. Figures. The old-timers never believed in surveys." He pointed toward a stand of birch to the left. "Your line runs to that big white birch and down to the rock that looks like a turtle. Other side's that pine with the lightning scar. You get the cove, too. Good spot for brook trout." He hesitated. "You planning to sell?" I blinked. "No." "Why?" "Lady came by last week asking about the place. Sharpshoes for a camp road. Said she was with some development outfit out of Portland, looking to buy up shoreline before it's all gone. Said she talked to your lawyer. Mr. Rowe, I said, and the name did a small, ugly dance in my mouth. It's funny how words can turn like that. A name and a vowel and an association, and you can't unbraid them. Yep, that was it. Cal's eyes went out over the water, gauging the distance. Folks are sniffing around. Your land's old. The kind with clauses built into the deeds that can be, let's just say, interpreted. Be careful who you smile at. I don't feel much like smiling, I said, and he laughed. The sound like a porch screen door swinging shut. He helped me bring in a small load of wood from the pile that had slumped like a tired soldier. He showed me how to jigger the window in the bedroom so it would close without catching. He told me there was a bean supper tonight, and if I showed up, someone would put a plate in my hand before I even said my name. A newcomer's only new if you don't have a story, he said. You come with one. You're halfway to being old news. When he left, I felt the cabin exhale. It's an odd thing to feel welcomed by a place that doesn't know you. It reminded me of the first PTA meeting I went to when Ashley was in kindergarten. I stood in a room full of mothers who had coordinated nail polish with their party platters, and the woman at the sign-in table smiled at me like a benediction. Come in. You belong here because you're willing to help. Around noon, I tackled the bedroom. The quilt on the bed was faded, a log cabin pattern worn to tenderness at the corners. As I shook it out in the light, something fell from the hem, a small key, rust laced along the teeth, tied with a piece of twine. I held it in my palm, the way you hold a baby bird you mean to set free. It had a tag, brown paper stiffened with time. The handwriting was Ed's, slanted and firm. Closet, it said. 3 letters that made my breath hitch. The closet was shallow, its door a reluctant participant. Inside, the usual. Some old waders, a flannel shirt that smelled of damp and music from another era, a tackle box. But at the back, the paneling had a seam the others did not. I ran my fingers along it and felt a catch, a tiny metal circle glued flush with the wood. The key rasped before it fit. When I turned it, the panel released with a sigh. Inside was a shallow safe, the kind you buy at a hardware store if you believe in the modest romance of secrets. I sat on the floor. The dust tasted like the attic of my childhood. I turned the handle and pulled. The door stuck, then gave, grudging. Inside, wrapped in a yellowed towel, were things that made my scalp prickle, as if the hair itself understood before my mind did. Not money, not jewelry. A leather-bound notebook. A packet of letters tied with red string. A photocopy of a map. And a postcard with a picture of the very dock outside. A sloppy scrawl on the back in Ed's hand. For when you need to remember what was true. My heart thudded in my chest, an old drum remembering a parade. I took the notebook out carefully and opened it. The first page was a ledger, dates and amounts, notations in the margin that could have been shorthand for dreams or crimes. I didn't know which. Transfers. Bear with me, he had written once in the margin. Then, tell Margaret when you take the time to be brave. I traced his letters as if they were the face of a person I loved. My throat went tight. Ed, who had smiled and said protect, had also folded a proof of something into a towel in a closet I didn't know held more than old shirts. I picked up the letters. The first was addressed to me, written last summer, the date tight with intent. I set it down. I wasn't ready. The map slid into my lap. It showed the lake, notched and irregular. A shaded area marked the land I knew from the deed. Another shape traced something larger, a boundary that stretched farther than I would have guessed, into woods that felt like someone else's. Next to it, a notation in Ed's hand. Grandfathered rights. The words made no sense and perfect sense all at once. I am not a lawyer, but I am a woman who understands how power hides in words. My phone buzzed on the mattress behind me. Ashley's name lit the screen. I stared at it until the buzzing stopped. It started again, a message this time. Hey, just checking in. Did you get there? Also, Mr. Rowe asked if you'd consider an offer on the cabin. He has someone interested. Could be an easy way to have some cash cushion. Think about it. I looked at the safe. I looked at the map. I looked out the window at the water that had held this place steady longer than our marriage. Longer than my grief. longer than the way money rearranged us. I felt my jaw set in a way I recognized. The same way it did when Ashley was 3 and refused to wear a coat. The same way it did when the radiologist spoke in euphemisms and I pressed him for plain words. I am not a woman who makes trouble, but I have always been a woman who holds a line. I picked up the envelope with my name and found a chair and sat. The paper crackled. His handwriting was slower than it used to be. "Dear Margaret," it began. "I don't know anymore how you measure fairness. I know what a lifetime looks like on a ledger and what it looks like at a sink full of dishes. I know this cabin was the only thing we owned that wasn't tangled up in favors, and a company we built on good intentions. I know Ashley is strong and the world will love her for it. I know you are stronger and the world forgot to notice. If you find this, it means I didn't say what I needed to before the paperwork made it an argument. What I owe you is not money. It is the truth. It's here." He wrote about his uncle, the one with the camp and a habit of squirreling away important papers in stupid places. He wrote about a conservation easement signed in 1971 that granted use and rights under conditions that made developers curse. He wrote about a conversation with Mr. Rowe that left a bad taste in his mouth and a conviction that sometimes protection looks like a trap. He wrote about Ashley, about the way she would be courted by numbers that sounded like safety. He wrote about the check he had received 3 months before he died, settlement from a case he hadn't told me about, because he thought he could fix it on his own, and about how he had put it into an account with my name on it and no one else's, accessible only through the name of a place that meant nothing to anyone but us. He wrote, "You always did the things nobody thanked you for. Take this as someone finally thanking you." He wrote, "Don't call Rowe. Call Murphy in Bangor. He owes me a favor and he respects stubborn women." I set the letter in my lap and pressed my hands to my eyes until the darkness was absolute. When I opened them, the cabin looked the same, but I did not. There is a moment when grief shifts in your body from a weight to a muscle. You feel the change like a fire catching. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Ashley. "Mom? Mr. Rowe says the buyer is on a tight timeline. She can do cash, close next week. You don't want to winter up there. It's too much. Let me take care of this. Let me take care of this." If I had $1 for every time that phrase had been applied to me, sometimes gently, sometimes like a leash, I would be the one with brokerage accounts and a lawyer on retainer. I thought about the way Ashley had turned my life into a project plan. I thought about the way I'd let people mistake my consent for approval for 42 years. I thought about the cabin, the map, the notebook, the name of a lawyer in Bangor. I thought about the fact that my daughter, my own child, had smiled at me and applied a spreadsheet to my future without asking me what shape it should take. I texted back, "I got here fine. I need time." No heart emoji arrived, no acknowledgement of my independence. Or if there was one, it was hidden in the dots that appeared and disappeared. Finally, "Time is money, Mom." I set the phone down. The old insult of that phrase struck me differently now. Maybe time is money in boardrooms and at closings. In a marriage, time is dishes and bedtime stories and the slow work of forgiveness. In a body, time is what teaches you that you can breathe through pain longer than you think. That afternoon, I went to the town office. It was a low building next to the library, a bulletin board out front cluttered with notices for lost cats and a sign-up sheet for summer kids' soccer. Inside, the clerk was a woman about my age with hair the color of rain and a Red Sox mug on her desk. Her name tag said Lucille. I told her my name. I told her I was trying to understand my deed. She smiled. "Welcome to town, Margaret Bennett," she said. "Let's see what you've got." We pored over maps with the patience of people who know that knowing where you stand matters. She pulled out a big book with leather corners and flipped to a page that smelled like decades. We traced lines with our fingers. We found the note Ed had flagged in the copy in the safe, the language about grandfathered rights that a careless eye would miss. Lucille pursed her lips. "It's old," she said, "but it stands. You'll want a good lawyer to make sure nobody plays fast and loose. Not Rowe." "Murphy and Bangor?" I asked, and she nodded as if we'd been in the same conversation all along. "Good man, tough. He'll explain it plain." She reached for a card holder and pulled out a business card with a clean font. "He fishes here sometimes," she said. "Knows how things tangle." On my way out, an older man on the porch tipped his cap at me. "You're the Bennett widow," he said without malice. "Welcome." I thanked him and bought a whoopie pie at the store because that felt like the kind of hospitality I could accept. I ate it in the car, the frosting smearing sweet and stubborn, and laughed for the first time in days, the sound startling and small. That evening, my phone lit up with a photo from Ashley. It was the living room of the house that was now hers, all clean lines and quiet things, staged as if buyers were about to arrive with their soft-voiced compliments. "Looks good, right?" she wrote. "I had the rug cleaned. I'm thinking of painting the dining room a greige. Everything neutral sells." I stared at the photo until the shapes blurred. That room had seen birthday cakes and band recitals, and fights about curfews. It had seen me dance alone, chewing on a strand of Christmas lights, trying to find the bad bulb. It had seen Ed fall asleep with a book on his chest after long days, his glasses crooked. Now it wore its grief like an expensive coat. It wasn't wrong. It wasn't right. It was Ash. "Looks fine," I typed back, because I could not bring myself to land on an argument in a text bubble. I would talk to her. I would tell her that fine is not the same as home. I would tell her about the notebook and the letter and the map. I would tell her that there are different kinds of safety, and that the one she was choosing might be a trap disguised as a promise. When it got dark, I walked down to the dock. The boards complained. The water lifted and set them like a lullaby. The stars came on without asking anyone's permission. There was a chill in the air that I knew would sink its teeth in come November, and I felt a thrill at the thought of showing winter my own teeth. I tucked my hands into my sleeves and breathed. Somewhere out there, a fish turned in the water. Quicksilver. The cabin behind me made its small wood noises. I thought of the ledger in the notebook, the names and amounts that whispered of something that could be used to push back. I thought of calling Murphy in the morning. I thought of walking into a room and not apologizing for taking up space. I had always believed that survival looks like endurance. You fold napkins. You check boxes. You bear what needs to be borne. But sitting there with the lake unpacking itself at my feet, I wondered if survival was also a choice you make when someone sets a pen in your hand and tells you it's already been decided. I did not sign this future. I am not a line item on someone else's ledger. In the days that followed, I learned the cabin's habits, where it hid the worst of its drafts, how the afternoon light fell across the table like a blessing. I met neighbors whose names slid into my ear like old songs. Ruth with her strawberry jam and gossip delivered with a spoon, Mike who plowed driveways in winter and invited me to his daughter's graduation party in July. Because in places like this, the line between invitation and inevitability is thin. I took long walks on the dirt road and nodded at people who nodded back. I went to the bean supper and sat at a table with strangers who spoke to me like we were cousins at a reunion and put extra brown bread on my plate. Everyone knew who I was. Widow ties to a place like a name tag. They let me be new without asking me to be a mascot. If I cried in the bathroom over the sink, nobody knocked. I called Murphy. His voice had a sandpaper warmth. He listened. He didn't tell me what to feel. He told me what to do, what copies to make, what not to say, which calls to ignore. He said the words I needed. "You have more power here than you think." He explained the easement, the way the cabin had been insulated not by sentiment but by law. He told me Roe would test me. He told me developers like tight timelines because pressure makes good people polite. And Ashley? She called. She texted. She sent more photos. She alternated between concern and insistence. The way a person trained to negotiate wears compassion, like a suit that fits perfectly because it's made of numbers. "I've always taken care of things," she said once. "It's what I'm good at." I could hear the plea under it, the child who had learned that competence is love. I had taught her that. I realized with a jolt so sharp I had to sit down. I had clapped when she brought home report cards. I had bragged when she got promotions. I had made busy the family currency and spent it on all of us. And now here we were, both of us counting different kinds of worth. The lawyer from Portland called too. A woman whose voice had the cheer of someone who sells something expensive you can't quite afford. "We can take this off your hands," she said when I picked up by mistake. "You'll be spared the maintenance, the taxes. Winters are hard up there." "I lived through the blizzard of '78, I said, and she laughed, the sound like ice breaking at the edge of a roof. "Of course," she said smoothly. "All I mean is, we offer convenience, peace of mind." Peace of mind, I have learned, is a phrase people use when they want you to stop thinking. "I have an attorney," I said, my new sentence, my cloak. "He'll be in touch." And there, between lake and ledger, between my daughter's tidy plans and my own ragged instincts, a larger conflict gathered, like thunder I couldn't see yet, but could feel in the soles of my feet. I knew Ashley was not my enemy. She was my child. But I also knew she had aligned herself with a machine that would flatten me out of convenience, not malice. There's an important difference. It doesn't make a dent in the damage. On the third evening, I opened the notebook again. I started to read the ledger like a person deciphering a code. Payments from a company I didn't recognize with a name that sounded like somebody's idea of a mountain. Transfers timed to avoid notice. Notes to himself in the margin. "Don't let Rose see this. Call M at the bank in Orono." It made me feel a little sick and a little relieved, a strange combination I had become accustomed to in the last months of Ed's life. It is possible to be betrayed and loved at the same time. It is possible to be left out and left something precious. The human heart is not tidy. I closed the book, put my hand flat on the worn leather. "Ed," I said into the empty room, and the loon called back across the lake as if to answer me. "I am not going to let them take this. I am not going to be an afterthought. There are vows you say in churches, and vows you say in kitchens, and vows you say to a lake because you need the big sky to hear you and take you seriously." This was one of those. When the phone buzzed again, I didn't flinch. I knew there would be a storm. I knew there would be pressure, more polite phrases like cash buyer and timelines, and "let us help you." I knew Ashley would stand in the doorway of the cabin soon enough with her polished nails and her clipboard and say, "You can't possibly want this place, Mom." And I would tell her that want isn't always the point. Sometimes place wants you, and you are wise to let it. The day I left the lawyer's office, the life I had built cracked like old glass. Now, sitting in a cabin that smelled like wood smoke and possibility, I could feel something else under my palms. Not the old life returning. That's not how the world works. This was different. This was the outline of a woman I had been underneath the service and the casserole and the patience. This was a woman who would drive into Bangor with a folder of documents and sit across from a man named Murphy and ask questions without apologizing for needing answers. This was a woman who would tell her daughter, gently but firmly, no. This was a woman who would endure a winter if she had to, and learn the stern grace of hunkering down. The loon called again. The wind pinched the top of the lake and turned it into a field of tiny, bright coins. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked and was answered. I could smell beans and molasses from the grange if I let myself pretend. I went inside and turned on the lamp with the fishing lure embedded in the base, and opened the letter again and read the last line because it was a blessing I didn't know I'd ever get. "Margaret, I didn't protect you the way you deserved. I'm sorry. Take this as a beginning." It was not personal, Ashley would say, just paperwork. But my name was written in a careful tilt on a piece of paper that had waited for me in an old cabin with a roof of moss. And there, in the 9th decade of a life that had needed so many small, forgotten acts, I realized something that would be the seed of the fight to come. Sometimes protection looks like a place with creaky floorboards and a hidden safe. Sometimes the thing everyone forgot is the only thing standing between you and the machinery that would grind you into gratitude. Sometimes the only person who can say enough on your behalf is you. I washed the 2 chipped mugs and set them to dry. I folded the yellowed towel and put it back in the safe with the notebook and the map and the part of the letter I didn't want topside yet. I closed the panel and turned the key and tucked it back into the hem of the quilt, because some rituals you learn quickly when you have something worth keeping. Then I sat at the table with a piece of paper and a pen that scratched and began to write down the names of the things I would not let go. I wrote them like a prayer, like a list for the grocery store of my soul. When the phone rang again, I let it ring. The lake and I had made a plan. And in the quiet between the rings, I felt ready. In the morning, I woke before the lake. A gray light pressed against the windows like a polite visitor. I made tea with water that tasted faintly of iron and pine, and I folded the yellowed towel back into the safe with the notebook and the map and the letter. I threaded the little rusty key onto a scrap of twine and tied it around my neck. It was silly, maybe, to wear a key like a talisman in a place where I was the only one who needed to unlock things, but it rested against my collarbone like a steadying hand. Every time I reached up without thinking and touched it, I felt a small courage. If I had to choose an object to say who I was becoming, this would be it. Not the china, not the glossy leather of the lawyer's folders, but a small practical thing that opened a door I had not known to look for. Murphy called at 9 like he said he would. I stood by the window to get decent cell service and watched a pair of ducks draw a wrinkle across the water. When he said my name, Margaret, not ma'am, not honey, I felt steadier. He told me what to gather and what to ignore. Make certified copies of the deed, photograph the map, and keep the originals wrapped and away from the damp. Don't speak to Roe. If anyone shows up uninvited, you are under no obligation to let them in. Record a notice at the registry in Ellsworth. He had a way of saying, "You can do this," without turning it into a sermon. "I'm sending you a form," he said, "to record the conservation language. It isn't magic, but it will make anyone who wants to be fast think twice." "Do you think they're trying to be fast?" I asked, though my body already knew the answer. The texts from Ashley, the eager voice of the woman from Portland, convenience dressed up as kindness. "I think people rush what they think they can get away with," he said, not unkind. "You don't have to keep up with their pace. Make them keep up with yours." After we hung up, I made a list on a sheet of lined paper I found in a drawer. One of those pads with a hardware store's logo at the top, from a place called Aubuchon, somewhere inland. My handwriting, which had grown small over the years of making grocery lists and appointment notes, spread out a little. "Call Ellsworth Registry. Photocopy notebook pages, ledger only for now. Ask Lucille about plan board schedule." I added at the bottom in the same letters, "Breathe. It helps to boss yourself when other people have been so good at it for so long." At the bank in town, the teller wore her hair in a neat bun and had blue readers perched on her head. "Morning," she said with that open Maine tone that can be a greeting or a warning. I slid the set of instructions Murphy had emailed to them, and my ID, under the glass. "Oh yes," she said, reading. "We can notarize those copies." She stamped the papers with calm efficiency. "What a day for paperwork," she added, and I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. Because in my life, paperwork had become both storm and weather forecast. When she finished, she looked at my name again. "My husband used to fish with a Bennett up at the ridge. Any relation?" "By marriage," I said. "He's gone now." "I'm sorry," she said simply, and the simplicity was a kindness. "If you need coffee, there's some in the corner. It's not Dunkin', but it'll do." I poured myself a styrofoam cup, and the smell took me back to the lawyer's office. The lilies, the cold air, the way the word bequeath had rung like a bell I hadn't asked to hear. I shook the memory off like a wet coat. When I walked back to my car, a gust of wind sent a swirl of brown needles across the parking lot, and my key bumped against my throat. For a second, I thought of Ashley at 12, swinging her house key on a ribbon because she liked the way it thumped her heart when she ran to catch the bus. We had always been practical women. We just measured practicality in different currencies. On the way back, I stopped at the library, because I trust libraries the way some people trust lighthouses. The librarian was a young man with a beard that looked like it might be an experiment. "We have a copier that works sometimes," he said cheerfully when I asked. "Today's a good day." You lucked out. As the machine hummed and spat out pages, I thought about Ed making a ledger of things he had not had the courage to say out loud. "Bear with me," he had written. "Tell Margaret when you take the time to be brave. There is a tenderness in a man admitting fear on paper." I slid the copies into a manila folder and felt a certain satisfaction in the sound of cardboard against cardboard. The librarian stamped my hand with an ink moose head on my way out. "For luck," he said, as if he knew more than he let on. When I turned down the camp road that afternoon, a glossy black SUV was parked at the bend, tires clean in a way that made me smile. Ashley was leaning against the hood, her arms crossed tight, flanked by two people with the kind of posture people get in conference rooms. I put the car in park and sat for a breath. The loon called, and the key against my throat felt warmer. I opened the door and stepped out into the resin-scented air that had already started to feel like a salve. "Mom," Ashley said, her voice bright and brittle. "Good, you're here. This is Paige from North Coast Development, and this is Mr. Rowe. We were in the area." "In the area," I repeated. "Portland's an hour and a half from here." "Traffic was light," Mr. Rowe answered smoothly. He wore the same affable smile I'd seen in the mahogany conference room. It looked out of place against the backdrop of pines. "We thought we could save you some trips. Be efficient." Paige had sharp hair and a sharp smile and shoes that sunk, just a little, into the soft shoulder of the road. "We're prepared to make you a very generous cash offer for your—" She glanced over my shoulder. "Cabin. We can take on all the headaches. You'll be free to— relax. Relax." I thought of the mornings of my life when I had been up before dawn stirring a pot of oatmeal for a feverish child, the nights in hospitals counting the seconds in Ed's breathing. Relax felt like somebody handing me a chair in the middle of a wind and telling me the chair would keep me from blowing away. I met Paige's eyes and thought about how the lake would look in February. Hard as truth, cracked in a pattern only the cold understood. "I have an attorney," I said, a sentence I was getting good at. "He'll be in touch." "We don't have to make this adversarial," Mr. Rowe put in. "We can—" "Ashley," I said, turning to my daughter. "Did you know they were coming?" She hesitated. The smallest falter, the smallest crack. Yes. I thought it would be better to have options. You know you're not going to winter here. You don't have to prove anything. There's a lovely place near me in Wellesley. I got their brochure. It's not a nursing home. It's really nice. They have classes, a book club, a fitness center. You could make friends." "I have friends," I said, and I felt my mouth curve not in a smile, but in a small baffled grief. "I've been here 3 days, and I have a Lucille and a Cal and a Ruth who makes jam and gossip in equal amounts." Her face did something I had seen it do when she was 6, and I told her she couldn't have a second popsicle. Disbelief that the world would not bend towards her reason. "You made friends at a bean supper, Mom. It's not Wall Street," I finished for her. "No, it's beans and brown bread and the feeling of being led into a long-standing joke you don't have to understand yet to laugh at." I took a breath. "What it also is, Ashley, is mine." Paige stepped in, her smile professional. "We've done our homework," she said. "We know there's some quaint language in your deed. Our legal team is prepared to work with you to make sure you're fully compensated for any restrictions." "Quaint," I said, tasting the word. I thought of Ed's careful letters and the map with its shaded border. "I'll keep my quaintness." "Mom," Ashley said softly, the softness that always meant a push was coming. "It's a lot of responsibility. The taxes alone are paid," I cut in, "and will continue to be paid. I appreciate your concern." My voice was even. There's a power in not raising your voice, in keeping it steady when the ground under you is shifting. "I am not selling." Rose's smile slipped a fraction. "We'll be in touch," he said, which in his mouth sounded like a promise and a warning. He gave me a card I didn't take. Paige gave me a brochure with trees and a family in sweaters on the cover that had never had sap stuck to their fingers. Ashley stood there, looking at me with eyes I had taught to read. "I'll walk with you to the porch," I said to my daughter, because I needed to say something that wasn't no. We walked in silence, the pebbles cracking underfoot. When we reached the steps, she touched the railing as if to test that it wouldn't splinter. "I don't understand you," she said, not accusingly, but as if she were truly bewildered. "Dad left you a—" She stopped, searching for a word that wouldn't insult me. "Project. I'm trying to make it easier." And I'm trying to show you that easier isn't always better, I said. Do you remember when you were little and you insisted on making pancakes by yourself? You spilled batter on the stove, and the first one stuck, and the second one was raw in the middle, and you cried. I stood there with a spatula in my hand and wanted to take over, but I didn't. I watched you throw away 2, and then 3, and then finally, you flipped one that was perfect, and you danced in your socks. You learned by burning your knuckles a little. This isn't pancakes, she said, a shred of exasperation encrusted in her tone like frost on the edge of a window. This is your life. It is, I agreed. And it's mine. She looked past me at the lake, and for a second something softened. I used to think the loon sounded like somebody crying. Does it still? Or is that just memory? It still does, I said. It doesn't stop them from singing. She shifted, helpless in a way that scared me because I had only ever known my daughter as competent. If you change your mind, you'll call? If you start listening, I said, I'll call. She nodded, square as a check mark. When she turned to go, she stopped and touched my arm. At least let me get you a proper space heater, she said. And it was so ordinary that I let out the breath I'd been holding. Ordinary can be a bridge. After they left, I stood on the porch with my hand on the rough post and watched the road swallow the SUV. I felt the heat rise into my face. Not rage, exactly, but a kind of flushing that told me my body had been insulted and was choosing to circulate itself anyway. I had loved my daughter every day of her life. Loving her was not the same as letting her decide it for me. The town calendar said the planning board meeting was on Thursday night at the old brick town hall, 2 streets over from the post office. I called Lucille to confirm. You thinking of going? She asked, a friendly hum under her words. I am, I said. Do you know if North Coast is on the agenda? Oh, they are. Item 3. Paper shuffled. Preliminary discussion of shoreline development variance, Wilkinson Pond District. That's your lake, dear. Do people get to speak? I asked, though I already knew I would. There's public comment. Folks can say their piece. She hesitated. It helps to bring facts, not just feelings. But feelings don't hurt. It puts a human face on it. I have both, I said, thinking of the notebook and the map and the letter, and the spot on my palm where the key had pressed last night when I slept on it by accident. On the day of the meeting, I drove to Ellsworth and recorded the notice Murphy had prepared. The registry was cool and smelled like paper and winter coats. The clerk stamped with the same solemnity I imagine border agents bring to passports. All set, she said when she handed me the receipt, and the phrase made me think of the first time a nurse had handed me a newborn Ashley, swaddled and unamused. All set, as if readiness were something someone could hand you. Maybe it is, sometimes, and you just have to decide to keep holding it. At home, I put the folder in a tote bag along with the blue willow teacup padded in dish towels. The teacup was not strictly necessary. It was my grandmother's. It would be a foolish thing to carry into a room where men in fleece vests would discuss setbacks and footage. But I wanted a thing in my hand that reminded me who I came from. My grandmother left school at 14 to work in a mill. She could cut a pattern by eye and saved the good scraps to make a quilt that made it through 3 moves and a winter in a damp trunk. If she could stitch warmth together from remnants, I could speak. The town hall was already warm with bodies when I arrived. Coats hung over the backs of folding chairs. The stage at the front had a row of tables, 4 board members peering at papers under strong lights. Cal was there, standing with another man near the back, and he lifted his hand when he saw me. Ruth waved me over to a seat she'd saved with a scarf. You'll want to see their eyes, she whispered, sliding me the spot by the aisle. Makes you brave. North Coast arrived in a rustle of good hair and better folders. Paige, her smile turned down to respectable, a man with a button-down that telegraphed expensive, and behind them, my breath hitched, Ashley, carrying a thin briefcase I recognized. She looked different in this light, older and younger at once. She saw me and changed course, sliding into the seat beside me. You don't have to do this, she murmured, as if we were in church and I had stood when we were all supposed to kneel. Let them handle it. They know the process. This process is my life, I said back, not unkindly. I took her hand and squeezed once. She squeezed back after half a beat. It felt like a memory remembered just a second too late. The meeting started with the drumming of a gavel. The chair, a man with a red face and eyebrows like hedgerows, read the agenda. Item 1, roof beams for the fire station. Item 2, a new freezer for the school cafeteria. Then, Item 3. Paige rose with a poise that suggested ballet classes. She introduced herself and North Coast, spoke in a careful arc about responsible development, about tax base, about opportunity. She said words like green space and stewardship. She pointed at a map on an easel that took up more space than the one Ed had folded into a towel. The lines on her map were clean and showed a shoreline dotted with little squares that looked like playhouses. We want to bring this underutilized asset to life, she said, and I felt the key press into my sternum, a nudge. Public comment? The chair asked after the board asked a few questions about road widths and fire access. Hands went up. A man in a plaid shirt that read like a resume named a list of animals that lived in the cove. Loons, turtles, something rare that made the board nod. A woman talked about noise. Cal, in his economical way, pointed out the way stormwater ran and where it would go. Then I stood. My name is Margaret Bennett, I said, my voice unexpectedly steady. I live on the property North Coast refers to as an underutilized asset. It's my home. I felt 100 eyes land on me. There was a murmur at the word home. Soft, the way people in small towns respect the word like it's a neighbor. I'm not going to talk about the sound of the loons, I continued, though I wanted to. I'm going to talk about paper. I lifted the folder. The manila looked plain, almost silly, in the fluorescent light. I took out the copy of the old map and the cover page of the notebook with Ed's careful hand. This, I said, is a copy of a conservation easement recorded in 1971 that covers the shoreline North Coast is proposing to develop. It stipulates that this land cannot be subdivided beyond what already exists, and that certain rights, access and use, are held in perpetuity. The language is old. It's quaint, if you like that word. I glanced at Paige, not unkindly. But we have a notion around here that old things count. The chair leaned forward. Does our file reflect this? Lucille, at her clerk's table, shuffled papers, deft. We have a reference in the deed book, she said, tapping a page with one well-kept nail. It hasn't been properly recorded in this context, yet. Recorded this afternoon, I said. In Ellsworth. I handed the stamped notice down the aisle. It felt like passing a hymn book. Each pair of hands held it a moment and moved it on. When it reached the table, a buzz started. Not hostile, but awake. Paige's smile held. Thin. We were not made aware. You were, I said before I could stop myself, and then softened. Or your attorney was. My husband discussed it with Mr. Rowe last fall. I have his notes. He also left a letter that suggests he believed there was a conflict of interest that might make some of the counsel we received less than impartial. I felt my hands tremble and tightened them around the edges of the folder. I'm not accusing anyone of bad intentions. I found Mr. Rowe's eyes. I'm reminding us that intentions are not the same as outcomes. Rowe's face had gone a careful kind of blank. In that blankness, I saw the scuff marks of too many polite endings. He leaned toward the board. We're all on the same side here, he began. Buttered toast. Wanting what's best for the town and for Mrs. Bennett. Mrs. Bennett is me, I said. You may mean my daughter. She is Miss Bennett. I am Mrs. There was a little ripple. I hadn't meant it as a lash, only as a correction, but it felt good, like setting a picture straight on a wall. I could feel Ashley beside me, still bristling, both. The chair cleared his throat. We would need to review this old language with counsel, he said. We can't proceed on a variance without clarity on easements and rights. That's just good sense. Good sense, Cal echoed from the back like a benediction. I reached into the tote and took out the blue willow teacup. It fit in my palm, the curve of it familiar the way your own face is when you catch it in a mirror at the top of a stair. "This is not legal," I said, and a few people smiled. "This is my grandmother's cup. My mother wrapped it in tissue every time we moved. She told me stories over this pattern. The time they had to stretch a chicken to feed 6. The time the electricity went out, and they read by the window because the light was free." I held it up. The board members leaned in, the room too. "I brought it because paper is not the only thing that holds a family together," I said. "And because for the last few weeks my life has been measured in deeds and codes. And codes to alarms I don't know anymore. But I wanted you to see that what looks like a cabin to be parceled is a life that has tried to be honorable. I'm not against growth. I'm not against taxes. I'm not even against people making money. But I am against being erased." When I sat down, my hands were shaking so much I had to put the teacup on the floor between my feet for a minute. Ashley reached down and steadied it with me. For a heartbeat, our fingers overlapped the handle. She didn't look at me, but she didn't let go until I did. The board conferred with the town's attorney, an older man with a slow way of speaking that felt like walking. He was careful, and in his care, I felt the gravity of place. He used words like notice and cloud, and eventually, inevitably, postponement. "We will table North Coast's application until we receive clarification on the easement and the rights of the current landholder," the chair announced. A low murmur rolled through the room. Paige gathered her papers with dignity. It is possible to be dignified and stymied at the same time. She nodded to the board, but not to me. Mr. Rowe scribbled something down that might as well have been an apology for how quickly he was leaving. Beside me, Ashley made a sound that could have been a sigh or a swallow. When the meeting adjourned, people stood in a rustle of clothes that felt like rain. Strangers touched my sleeve and said, "Good job," and "You said it nice." Ruth pressed a wrapped brownie into my hand. "For later," she said. "Sugar helps." Outside, the air had shifted. You could smell rain, or the wish for it. Ashley stood on the steps with her arms folded, a pose that once meant she was cold, and now meant she was working something out. "Mom," she said, her voice softer, "where did you get that map?" "In the cabin," I said. "Behind a panel in the closet. There was a safe. He left me a letter." I patted the tote bag. "He left us the truth, the way he could." She shook her head, not in denial, in disorientation. "I didn't know." She looked almost embarrassed. "I thought—" She didn't finish. What she had thought, maybe, was that she could manage me the way she managed budgets. I thought he was being unkind, I offered. "Old-fashioned," she said. "Unfair, after all those years." "Sometimes protection looks like a poor gift," I said. "Sometimes it is the only gift that gets you out of the fire." We stood there, two women whose lives had been rearranged by the same man's fear and love. "I'm not trying to take anything from you, Ashley. You will keep the house. You will keep the accounts. And I will keep this. But I won't be moved like a chair. Not anymore." She was quiet. People filtered past, some nodding at us, some looking away because it felt private. Then she did something I did not expect. She laughed. A small, bewildered laugh. "I bought you a flannel blanket," she said, as if this might be a bridge. "It's a good blanket," I said. "It will see some cold mornings." She nodded at the bag. "You really brought a teacup to a planning meeting?" "It's good to have something in your hand," I said, "in case you need to remember who you are." We walked to our cars, the gravel grinding under our feet. At her door, she fumbled with her keys. "I thought I was helping," she said again, but it sounded different, less like a defense and more like a confession. "I know," I said, and I did. "We have both mistaken control for care. We learned it in the same house." She looked at me then, fully. I saw the little girl again. The teenager. The woman. "So what happens now?" "Now," I said, and the word steadied me. "I go home. I meant the cabin, and she knew it. I make soup. I call Murphy in the morning. I patch the screen. I learn the sound the roof makes when it rains. And you go home too. You live your life. You can visit. We'll see if the loons sound like crying to you still." She smiled, crooked and new. "You always did like the sound of rain on a roof," she said, "even when it meant the gutters were clogged." "I'll buy a ladder," I said, "or I'll borrow one. That's what neighbors do here." We hugged. It wasn't the hug we used to exchange when she was small and her whole body flew into mine. It was careful, adult, mutually aware, but it was a hug. When she pulled away, she touched the key at my throat. "What's this?" "Courage," I said, and she laughed. "A key," I added, so she wouldn't think I'd gone mystical on her. To a thing I didn't know existed. After she drove away, I stopped at the general store and bought an onion, a head of garlic, a bag of carrots, and a loaf of brown bread wrapped in plastic that fogged a little from the warmth inside. The boy at the register asked if I wanted a paper, and I said no, because I was tired of other people's words. Back at the cabin, I chopped and stirred, and let the soup make its own case for being alive. The rain began in the dark like someone shushing the world to sleep. The roof did what roofs do. It spoke in a language of drips and ticks. I listened and didn't translate. The next few days were an odd combination of legal calls and domestic tasks. I took the ledger pages to Murphy. He had a kind of gladness I recognized in a person who sees a thing he can use for the good. He explained what we needed to file, how to write a letter to the Board of Overseers if it came to that, how to protect myself from sudden generous offers. He did not rush, which felt like a gift. When I left his office with a packet under my arm, and the conviction that I had stepped into my life instead of being shuttled past it, I stopped in Bangor for a bowl of chowder that steamed up my glasses. An older couple at the next table told me about the time the Penobscot froze so hard someone drove across it, and we all pretended that was a sensible thing. At the cabin, I patched screen with a needle and fishing line because that is what I had. The mice learned my traps. I learned the cabin's sounds at night and taught myself not to turn every creak into a story about danger. I found a rhythm. Tea, walk, call, chop, read, sleep, that borrowed from my old life and made something new. The key rested against my skin. Sometimes, when a wave of missing Ed broke over me so unexpectedly I had to sit down, I would press the key and the ache would find a place to go. Ashley called every couple of days. At first, she was perfunctory. "The contractor says the front walk has to be replaced. The new code requires a different pitch." Then she moved into concern. "Are you eating? Do you have enough blankets? Send me a list." Then curiosity. "How do you start a wood stove? YouTube makes it look complicated." And once, surprisingly, delight. "I made pancakes," she said. "They were terrible. The third one was perfect." I told her about the bean supper and the way the ladies at the Grange knew everyone's middle name. I told her about Cal showing me how to bleed the radiators come fall, about Ruth leaving a box of strawberries that tasted like the color red. I told her about the select board scheduling a work session to sort through the easement language, and about the letter Murphy had sent to Roe that used words like fiduciary and duty in a way that could not be mistaken for small talk. Roe did not call me again. He sent a letter on heavy paper that managed to say nothing politely. North Coast put out a press release about their commitment to working with the community. Someone taped it up on the bulletin board at the post office next to a flyer for a lost cat named Bix. People read both and nodded in the same rhythm. On a Sunday afternoon, Ashley surprised me by driving up alone in a sweater that looked less like armor and more like something you wear because it's clean. She carried a bag with a space heater and a bundle of mail from the house in Wellesley. My name in envelopes that didn't know it had moved. We made tea. I set out the good cookies because there are some truce-making tactics embedded in DNA in kitchens, and I am not a fool. She stood at the window and watched the lake. "It's not ugly," she said, and I laughed. "No," I said. "It isn't." She turned to me. "Do you think Dad meant to hurt me? With the will?" I took a breath and answered like I had promised myself I would. Plain, not cruel. I think he meant to protect something he wasn't sure how to name. And I think he did not trust you not to choose numbers over ducks. That's patronizing, she said, not angrily, but as if we were refining the definition. It is, I agreed. But sometimes we are patronizing even when we mean well. He underestimated your capacity for being something other than efficient. I did too. She nodded. I underestimated yours for being something other than accommodating. We sat with that. It felt like a plank laid across a gap. Not a bridge yet. Something to step on and test. Will you come to another meeting? I asked, surprising us both. She grimaced. Those chairs hurt. They do, I said. You can stand. I will, she said. And her voice was, finally, the voice she used when she promised herself something. When she left, she hugged me for real. Don't fall off a ladder, she muttered into my ear. And I had the absurd thought that there was a time when that sentence would have felt like an insult, and now it felt like love. I went back in and sat at the table with the ledger and the map and the cup. I made a new list. Not groceries, not tasks. A plan. Not a plan like a move-out timeline. A plan like a planting schedule. File the bar complaint if necessary. Meet with the conservation trust Lucille told me about. They had a director who ate a muffin at the library on Fridays and liked to talk about old maps. Offer a path across my land to the school kids who took the long road to the bus because of a washed-out culvert. Ask Mike about a fair rate for plowing. Send a check to the Grange for the freezer, even though no one had asked. The climax of a story is not always a shout. Sometimes it is the hush when a room realizes you will not yield. Sometimes it is a woman in her 60s holding a map up, so a panel of men can see the lines they do not get to redraw. Sometimes it is simply the moment you go from saying, I don't know to know. That night, storm clouds gathered from the west, and the lake wrinkled under their breath. I lit a fire in the stove I had learned to coax, and sat in the glow with the key warm on my chest. The phone buzzed. A message from a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Bennett, this is Valerie from the Bangor Daily, it read. We're doing a piece on shoreline development and local voices. Would you be willing to talk? I set the phone down and thought of how many times my voice had been used as a small noise in a larger story someone else wanted to tell. I thought of the press release. I thought of my grandmother's cup. I picked up the phone and typed, I will, if we can also talk about old paper and the meaning of protect. Send. The rain began in earnest, a steady whisper. The roof spoke back in its dialect. I thought of Ed, his careful script, his desire to fix things, and his failure to admit when he couldn't. I thought of Ashley, her sharp edges and the child inside them. I thought of Mr. Rowe, and I wished him better clients. I thought of myself, 67, sitting in a room that smelled like wood smoke and soup, a ledger on the table, a map that had outlived several versions of me. When I went to bed, I tucked the key back under the hem of the quilt, and then changed my mind and reached for it again. I lay there with it in my palm, the metal a small, cool moon. The loon called once, twice, and then fell silent in the rain. My life had cracked like old glass on a gray Tuesday in a room that smelled like lilies and coffee. Tonight, it felt less like a crack and more like a seam, something strong, because it had been mended and could be again. I had believed that the only way to not be swallowed was to be agreeable. Turns out the way to not be swallowed is to be a rock in a stream and let the water find its own way around you. The stream still moves. You still exist. You shape each other without apology. In the morning, there would be more paper. There would be meetings. There would be messages couched in politeness and letters that might sting. There would be soup and a walk and the particular smell the pines gave off after rain. There would be me in this cabin, not hiding but holding. There would be the work of reteaching my daughter that love is not measured in how efficiently you can remove an obstacle from someone's path, but in how willing you are to walk alongside them when the path is the point. I turned on my side and listened to the rain until sleep came like a careful hand smoothing a blanket. The key pressed into my palm. Somewhere in the distance, beyond where the lake ended and the road began, men with folders and developers with charts reorganized their plans around a small old thing they had thought was pliable. The cabin stayed. The paper held. In the morning, there would be coffee, and the ducks would write their cursive on the water, and I would put my cup down and decide again. The Bangor piece ran the next morning, a slender headline on a site I had never thought to check. Local widow stands her ground against shoreline development. They had pictures. A photograph of me at the town hall holding the blue willow teacup, my hair windblown from the drive home, the key a dark dot at my throat. The article was fair. It quoted Murphy on the easement, it quoted Lucille on small-town memory, and it called the lake a quiet patch of Maine that remembers people by name. People called. Strangers called me Mrs. Bennett, and then, less formally, Margaret. Neighbors I had only seen on the road stopped by with casseroles that smelled like butter and thyme. Ruth left a jar of jam that tasted like red afternoons. Cal brought me a hand-forged hook for hanging the lantern on the porch. Each thing felt like a benediction, and with every knock at the door, the key at my collarbone hummed as if to say, "You are not alone." Murphy moved with a kind of careful certainty that made me glad I had listened to Lucille. He filed the recorded notice with a certified copy of the conservation language, and then, to make it harder for anyone to pretend ignorance, he sent a formal letter to Roe and to North Coast Development, laying out the legal limits and the obligations that rested with them. Roe responded with an email that read like a press release: regrets, a promise to review internal procedures, and an offer to talk. It was the kind of statement you make when you have been called on the carpet, and you are hoping the carpet can be restarched and put back in place. North Coast withdrew their application for the time being, a move that made partisan headlines in the local weekly, and led, later that week, to an invitation for them to come back and present a revised plan, one that included affordable cottages for locals and an environmental buffer. Paige's smile in the public hearing was smaller than the one she wore in the driveway, and she looked tired in a way that made me think of a woman who had learned to sell an idea before she had walked it to the end. The company's new proposal had consultants and diagrams and promises. The land would be developed sympathetically if it could be convinced it should be developed at all. I had no illusions that developers were monsters. Most of them were people who had learned a system and were good at playing it. They were not, however, people who had lived through a winter on this lake and heard the way the ice says yes and no. A small triumph came quietly, the kind that fits into the pocket where grief used to live. The local conservation trust, Lucille had tracked down the director for me over coffee at the library, offered to take an easement on the land that would enshrine public access for the town's schoolchildren and restrict subdivision in perpetuity. They would pay a modest sum to the estate, enough to satisfy concerns with taxes and maintenance, and they would work with me to make sure the cove remained exactly what it was, a place where loons sing and kids learn what a dock feels like under their feet. Murphy grinned the way men do when they finally get to use the word quiet in a legal sentence. "You did this," he said, and I felt the credit in my bones. Between court filings and phone calls, Ashley changed. She began to call with questions that were not about closing dates. "How does the wood stove work?" she asked once, and you would have thought she had asked how to land a plane. "Don't be clever," I said. "The trick is patience." She sent videos of a stove lit badly, and the third attempt triumphant. She visited, unannounced, and pulled a dented aluminum ladder out of her trunk and held it by the base while I climbed to sweep pine needles from the gutters. She brought me a box of my letters mailed in envelopes that had my name from Wellesley, printed in a tidy font. Someone at her address had forwarded them when she realized they were still arriving. The first time she saw the safe in the closet, she stood with her hands on her hips and looked like the woman who had once reorganized an entire office with color-coded tabs. There were so many things she did that read like efficiency. There were also so many things I finally learned to ask for. One afternoon, when the light had that long golden edge you get in late summer in Maine, she sat on the dock with her shoes off and watched the water. She had a thunk to her seriousness, a posture that suggested she measured everything in checklists. And then, when she thought she had finished, weighed it again against what her heart would allow. "Dad meant well," she said, not looking at me. "I get that. But the execution." I was furious when I heard. I thought, her voice broke like thin ice. I thought he was keeping things from me, and that I was the adult who had to fix the mess. "You were trying to care," I said, wrapping my fingers around the teacup I had brought to town. The pattern warmed in my hands like a small memory of heat. "You learn to care by doing. You're good at it, Ashley. But you also learned that you are responsible for fixing things that aren't yours to fix. She exhaled, a slow, honest sound. I wanted to be the person who could take care of you, she admitted. If I turned everything into a plan, if I rearranged things, I could keep the fear away. I thought if I made the numbers look solid, I could make the future look safe. I didn't think about how safety sometimes looks like a lid on a pot, boiling the thing you love until it becomes something else. You wanted to protect me the way you knew how, I said. You were not wrong. You were simply limited by the tools you had. She turned to face me then. The girl who had once stood on a chair to help me frost cupcakes, suddenly older and smaller at the same time. Can you forgive me? She asked. A question I had been asking myself for years in quieter contexts. The key at my collarbone felt like an answering coin. Of course, I said. And it was easier than I'd feared because we were both tired of carrying the ledger of offenses. But you will have to apologize in functional ways. Like, help me with the roof, bring better batteries for the smoke detector. Don't change the lock without telling me. She laughed, the sound a small, clear bell. Deal, she said. And you have to call me when the loon sounds funny. I'll come over and listen. So we rebuilt in scaffolds. She learned that some things cannot be fixed with spreadsheets, and I learned that asking for help was not the same as handing over my life. We traded competence for presence, and there, in the gap between those two currencies, something like forgiveness grew. Rose Firm sent a formal letter to my attorney accepting that the easement presented real constraints, and that they would refrain from further filings until counsel had reviewed the documents. It was a cold, efficient surrender, the kind that came with a promise to do better. I do not relish the thought of anyone losing a job or reputation, but there is a basic human calculus in being accountable when you have treated a person's life like a ledger. There was also a quiet ripple effect. People in town who had been on the fence about development began to speak up, not as opponents of growth, but as guardians of a pattern that had meaning beyond profit. The trust's director came up in fall to walk the property with me. We pointed out where the cattails came in, where the turtles sunned themselves on the boulder by the cove, where the school kids had once launched a raft that overturned instantly because that's what childhood tests you with. She suggested modest conservation signage, so children could learn the names of trees, and an occasional community cleanup that would keep the shoreline presentable without turning it into a parade of private houses. I signed the agreement with a pen that felt like a clasp. The key remained at my throat. I tucked it under the hem of my shirt for a ceremony, as if it needed to be close when I made a promise. Summer gave way to a shy autumn. The leaves went a brilliant, ordinary red. The loon persisted. The town erected a small plaque near the trail, where the children would come with their teachers to count nests and learn about shoreline ecology. On the first school visit, the children stamped in mud and shrieked with the joy of things that are not curated. A boy with crooked teeth asked me, without ceremony, if I knew how to make s'mores. I had to tell him, but I did it, and he pronounced them perfect in a way that felt like absolution. There was one particular evening that remained with me, a night when the sky had bled out every soft color and was left a clean, cold stretch of dark. Ashley knocked on my door and came in carrying a small cardboard box. She put it on the table and opened it. Inside were letters, the neat, expensive envelopes from Wellesley, but each had a note on top in her handwriting. For when you're lonely, one read. Another said, for when you win. Another, for when you want to remind me I am allowed to be stubborn. She had written them weeks ago, she said, and had meant to send them but had thought, absurdly, that she should deliver them in person. I felt something loosen, a muscle that had kept me ready to be small. You didn't have to, I said. I know, she said, and she sat down and took my hand. But I wanted to. Also, I bought the flannel blanket back from the house. I had it cleaned. You ruined my plans for revenge, I told her, because some of us need to keep humor like a talisman. She laughed and hugged me, and it was the ordinary, complex thing two adults do when they are learning to be in one another's lives without dissolving either person. Time does a kind of gentle alchemy. The paper trail that once seemed like a razor became instead a record of what had been. The ledger in Ed's notebook read like a map of a man's fear and his courage. I do not pretend to understand every decision he made. What I know is that the hidden safe and the letter were not just acts of patronage. They were his attempt to give me an instrument I could use. The key I wore was more than metal. It was language. It let me unlock not just a box, but also the possibility that my life could be defended by law and love. There were people who still thought of the cabin as a temporary place for me, a detour. They saw my living here as quaint, a retirement hobby, or worse, a cosset we had no right to. They could not see what I had learned in the rhythm of wood smoke mornings and the patient work of soups and small repairs. I learned how to unclog gutters. I learned how to say no with a calm face. I learned how to ask for help without apologizing for needing it. I learned how to be both fragile and fierce in the same breath. Spring came the second year I lived in the cabin, and with it a new confidence that was not loud but was unmistakable when you felt it settle. The trust had funded an interpretive sign near the trail. The town had adopted a small maintenance schedule, and Ashley had taken, when feasible, a few hours to come up and teach me to use her favorite apps, things that made my life easier without making my decisions for me. We started a small ritual. Every Sunday afternoon, she would bring over a loaf of bread or a jar of jam, and we would sit on the porch and talk about things like mortgages and loans, and the tension between being useful and being loved. Those talks were the repair work of a relationship that had been strained by visibility into one another's faults. We were learning to assume goodness and to require accountability. It was a richer, more sustainable currency. One afternoon, at the end of a long week at Murphy's, and at the town hall and with the trust, I took the key from under my shirt and walked to the front garden where I had planted a small maple sapling. I dug my hands into the soil, Maine dirt, loam that smelled like the clean bones of spring, and I wrapped the twine with the key around the young trunk like a blessing. The key hung there, a small, bright punctuation against the green. I did not tie it permanently. It was a token, not a lock. I wanted my granddaughter, or a neighbor's child, to look at it someday and see how an ordinary thing had been used to defend an ordinary life. The symbol was useful because it held both the old and the new, the worn thing of Ed's careful mind, and the fresh courage I was growing at 67. The key had once hidden a stash of papers. Now it marked a place where a child might come to learn the difference between a map and the land it described. You ask what came of the money. Ashley kept her inheritance. She used a portion of it, voluntarily, and with no coercion, to set up a small endowment with the Conservation Trust to maintain the little plot of shoreline in perpetuity. She did it because she wanted the peace of mind she had once offered me in a way that was genuine, and not a way to be in control. She still had her house and her account, and she has never been happier to spend a weekend in my company than on the summer afternoon she brings a casserole to share. We are both wealthier than before, in ways that do not amount to dollars and can't be listed on a balance sheet. In the end, what saved me was not cunning or litigation alone. What saved me was the town that showed up. What saved me was a ledger that revealed more than money. It revealed intention. What saved me was the courage to say no, and the generosity to say yes in places where it mattered. What saved me was the small, stubborn belief that I was not expendable. On a clear morning, I walked to the dock and listened to the loon, and let the lake write its cursive on the water. The key hung under my collar, warm against my skin. I thought of Ed in the way you think of somebody who gave you a gift and then left the room before you opened it. I forgave the complicated part of him, the man who could love fiercely and yet do harm through omission. I forgave myself for letting him and for learning to stand with my own feet planted. I am not the same woman who sat in the cold lawyer's office with lilies heaped in the corner, my dress thin against the AC. That woman cracked like old glass, and that breaking let something else in. A seam, mended with patient thread. I have found shelter here in the cabin that smelled of mouse droppings and pine, and shelter that is not a refuge from life, but a place to live it fully. I have found reconciliation with my daughter, and a deeper peace that comes from being responsible for my own choices. If you find a small key in a drawer someday, don't be afraid to wear it like a promise. It will remind you that sometimes the doors you need to open are the ones you thought were meant for someone else. Sometimes the bravest thing is the quiet persistence of showing up for your own life. If my story touched something in you, if you've ever had to stand up for a small, ordinary thing and been surprised that it mattered, please leave a comment about it below. Tell me about the keys you carry, the doors you keep closed, or the ones you're ready to open. If you found comfort here, press like. And if you'd like to hear how the town and I keep learning to live with one another, please subscribe. There are more afternoons and loons ahead, and I would like to share them with you. The lake keeps its own counsel, but a life is meant to be lived out loud, and sometimes that begins with a single, ordinary key.